It's that time of year. Let's take our first look at the 2024 NFL Draft with the Messenger's draft analyst, Mike Renner.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow, along with your host, James Rapien, joined today by Mike Renner of Renner Ranks here on the Locked On Podcast Network, his own podcast, part of the Locked On Network with us and the Messenger's draft analyst. In an episode brought to you by Gametime, where you can save $20 on your first purchase of tickets with code Locked On. Today, we're going to get into a first look at the 2024 draft, where the strengths and weaknesses are, where there's depth, where there's drop-offs, and it's going to be an interesting time. We've not talked about the draft this early in the calendar year in many years when we're talking about the Cincinnati Bengals. And Mike, how's it going? How's your preparation for draft season going? We're of course before the combine, before the All-Star game, so we're early in the process. But how's your feel for the draft at this point in early January?
It's going well. I'm sad you didn't introduce me as former Cincinnati resident, too. I lived there for 7 years, so I was deep in the
There's
Bengals.
So many things we could use. Former Cincinnati resident, mustache, Green Bay.
That one you didn't need to talk
stuff.
about, but I can share hold it up there, too. But this draft class, I'm very excited for, and Bengals fans should be, too, because this is one of the most talented draft classes. To me, it's right up there with 2021, and obviously the 2021 NFL draft turned out very good for the Cincinnati Bengals in a lot of different ways, one being Jamar Chase. But that's how it feels like at the top of this draft, at the very least, that there's just guys that are kind of can't miss, sort of positional prospects on the offensive side of the ball, like we saw in that 2021 class. They're just going to be like Pro Bowl to all pro type of players right out the gate. So, and even then past that, I think this first round, I'm going to have more first round grades in this than any of the past handful of years when it's all said and done. So it's just a very good draft class to find guys who can make immediate impact on roster. So very excited to see then some of these guys at the Senior Bowl, because now the Senior Bowl has a few juniors coming and playing, and then how they test out through the pre-draft.
The Bengals have the 18th pick, which is earlier, in the earliest since 2021, earlier than we're used to. Do you think, and obviously we'll focus a ton on round one leading up to the draft, but they could get one of those first round graded guys in round two? Is it realistic in that way? Because that's something over the past couple of years that was pretty unrealistic just based on where they were drafting.
I still don't think so, just in the way kind of the numbers shake out at that point. Was they going to be picked 50 in the second round that they'd be taken?
Yep.
Sometimes guys can fall with medicals, that sort of thing could happen. But I do think that anywhere in the top 50 to 75 in this draft class, I'd be expecting that guy to come in and start. Like it's good enough that you should be nabbing one to two, first and second rounders. You should be expecting both those guys to come in and play a role right away.
So if you're the Cincinnati Bengals, you're picking 18, you're picking around 50, because due to the tiebreakers, their pick in each round will change a little bit every round with all the teams are tied with. Yeah. You're thinking at least 2 starters, maybe 3 starters. For a team that has kind of drafted for the future the last couple of years, they haven't taken that approach where they're like, we need to get somebody in to start now. This year may be a little bit different with, if you've listened to the show earlier this week and you're an everydayer, we talked about all the Bengals starters that they have to replace more than normal in recent history anyway. A good year to have that problem, quote unquote. I mean, never good to need starters, but you know what I mean.
I think so. And I think so, especially with pick 18. I think there should be either a wide receiver, should they lose T. Higgins, that can come in and just take that role right away, or an offensive tackle that can come in right away. So I do think that's, if you're looking offensive side of the ball for the first time in a handful of years here early on in the draft, I think it's a good year to be in need of that. Not so much on the defensive side of the ball, but again, they've invested so many picks in the defense side of the ball. I do think that their attention probably is going to be served for the offense side of the ball here.
When you look at tackles, and I think that's going to be a big topic just in general for this team with Jonah Williams' uncertainty and likely to sign a huge deal elsewhere. What should our listeners be looking for outside of just reading you and listening to you and analysts out there, because there's plenty of draft coverage, but what should they be looking for? Because I can feel it. This is definitely time is a flat circle in Cincinnati, talking about offensive line play every offseason.
I mean, the fact that there are a lot of names in this class. So there's 4 guys that I would call, any given year top 15 sort of picks. They are Joe Alt from Notre Dame, Olu Fashanu from Penn State. Neither of those 2 guys are falling to the Bengals. And then Amarius Mims from Georgia and J.C. Latham from Alabama. So those 4 guys, say we go back to 2 years ago where it was Evan Neal, Ike Ekwonu, and Charles Cross, all top 10 picks. I have those 2 back-end guys with grades similar to Ike Ekwonu, Evan Neal. So it's like in a given class, they could have gone top 10. This class has too many guys, though, that I don't think all 4 of those are going top 10. I think I said the top 2 are going top 10. But that could mean a couple of those names fall down boards a little later on. And both those guys who I just mentioned, J.C. Latham from Alabama and Amarius Mims from Georgia, they both already played right tackle. So it would be an easy – played right tackle in college. So it would be an easy kind of slot in for Bengals fans. So I think those are the 2 names that you're kind of going to track where their draft stocks getting mentioned. Is it going to be – are they going to go back in the top 10 early teens? Or could they slide all the way down to the Bengals? Because I think that's your dream scenario if you're a Bengals fan.
There's just a concentration of quarterbacks, wide receivers that probably go early along with a couple of tackles. But like you mentioned, there's not a ton of defensive strength at the top of the draft. There's a couple of guys, but maybe not certainly not competing, I guess, with the offensive side of the ball. Are there any defensive guys that you think, if they're still there at 18, that realistically could slide to 18 or targets? Because I know Newton, the 3-tech from Illinois, is a guy that seems to make sense, would fit the bill for a team need and a guy that would be worth the pick.
Yeah, so there's 2 3-techs in this class that I think would make a lot of sense for the Bengals. You mentioned Jerzon Newton, Johnny Newton, one of them, 100% him. And I also think Byron Murphy from Texas could be in that conversation. Now, maybe not quite at pick 18. That might be a little early on, but if he drops down to pick 50, it would make a ton of sense there. Or even if you want to trade down from pick 18, whatnot. We'll see how it ends up shaking out. But those are the 2 guys I'd keep an eye on. To me, the class of this DT class, when you talk about guys who can actually play that role, rush the passer, and be worthy of, top 32 type selection.
Let's dive into more of some of the weaknesses. There are a bunch of Bengals weaknesses, as Jake mentioned, that I want to ask you about. Certainly tight end, running back. Those were 2 going into the 2023 season that I think will still be topics this offseason. So let's do that coming up next.
Today's episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by the Gametime app, who knows that buying tickets for any event, whether it's a playoff game, if you just can't get enough of the NFL and you still want to attend a game, even though the Bengals aren't in the playoffs, or since the Bengals season is over, maybe it's local college basketball, maybe it's music, comedy, a theater event near you. Gametime has you covered with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, their best price guarantee to take the guesswork out of buying tickets. It's the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase. The see your seat before you buy is something that I love to make sure I don't have an obstructive view. All-in prices, so you know your total up front. You know you're getting a great deal before you check out, and you can buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. Right now, you can save even more money using promo code LOCKEDON. You'll save $20 off your first purchase. All you got to do is download the app. Again, use promo code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today for last-minute tickets. Lowest price guaranteed.
Today's show is also brought to you by Schultz Jewelers. If you're looking for that right piece, maybe you're going to propose in 2024, well, you got to get the Schultz Jewelers, because whether you're looking at the various diamonds, maybe you want a custom-made piece, Matt Schultz and his team do an awesome job, and they're not going to sell you on anything. They're going to educate you on what they have, what they could design, what they could make for you, for her, for whoever you're looking for all year long. They just celebrated their 70th anniversary. They've been in the business a long time. Heck, they've been in business longer than the Bengals have been a franchise. And yes, they're big Bengals fans over there at Schultz Jewelers. So check them out at 2202 Dixie Highway in Fort Mitchell, just 5 minutes from the bridge into Kentucky, or check them out online at schultzdiamonds.com. That's SCHULZ diamonds.com. We know the Bengals strive for perfection. Schultz Jewelers does too, because when it has to be perfect, it has to be Schultz Jewelers.
James, you wanted to dive into some strengths, weaknesses. Go for it.
Yeah, let's start with the two main ones that I think we were talking about, especially when the Bengals started 1-3 at the beginning of the season. Tight end, running back. Where is the 2024 NFL draft class in those two positions? And I realize that the premium pick people are going to be very frustrated about this question, but I am curious about how deep those two spots are.
So I started laughing as you asked it, because truthfully, they're the two weakest spots in this draft, two weakest positions. If I had to rank all the positions in terms of relative strength, it would be those two. And like the only saving grace for this tight end class is the fact that it has Brock Bowers, the Georgia tight end. He will, I would bet good money, does not make it down to pick 18. Now, he could be within striking distance if you really think you're one piece away. And I think Brock Bowers is good enough that if you have a plan for how you want to feature a tight end going forward, he's a guy who would be worthy of a first-round pick. I think like he's almost even safer than Kyle Pitts was coming out of Florida in a number of different ways, even if he's a different type of player, more of a ground type of player, whereas Pitts is more of a vertical, like jump ball type of tight end. But after him, there's not a guy that I would love plugging and playing. You know, like this year's class, we saw Dalton Kincaid, we saw Sam Laporta, we saw Luke Musgrave, we saw Michael Mayer. There's not another guy even close to those guys as prospects, in my opinion. So is not have the depth at that point. Then a lot of guys end up getting overdrafted usually when that's the case in a tight end class. But I will say, if you're looking for like pure receivers, the names I'll throw out, probably Dallin Holker, Colorado State tight end. Is a guy who I think led all tight ends in the FBS in receptions and yards this past year, just a little undersized, not really a blocker. And then I like Cade Stover, the Ohio State tight end. I think he's not dynamic necessarily, but he's at least reliable at the tight end position, much more so than what they've had on their roster this past year. So he's a guy who probably is more of a plug and play, more towards the back end of day 2, day 3 sort of tight end. So it's not a great class. I'll just say that it's going to be slim pickings at the position. Running back now. Okay,
go ahead. I was just going to ask about one more tight end, Jatavion Sanders from Texas. What are your thoughts there?
So he is, honestly, he reminds me a lot of Irv Smith coming out of Alabama in that he's not he's not a route runner yet. He's not really a polished blocker yet. He's undersized, but he can run fast in a straight line. And truthfully, he doesn't have like great ball skills to like make plays outside his frame, but he doesn't drop a lot of easy ones. So he'll probably get drafted higher than I would draft him, purely because he's probably going to run like the high 4.4s, maybe low 4.5s. He's the best athlete after Brock Bowers in this draft class. He can, and that's a lot of routes you run at tight end in the NFL, right? It's like over routes, crossers, vertical, seams, that sort of thing. Like, and that just takes speed. And so he has that and he can produce. He's just not, kind of like what Bengals fans have seen with Irv Smith, just not super reliable in the other ways you want a tight end to be reliable. So I'm not going to be super high on him, but he'll probably go somewhere on day 2.
I could totally feel our audience just wincing the moment you mentioned Irv Smith Jr. Whether that's fair or not to Irv, I'm not trying to be mean, but that's why I reacted. Where would Brock Bowers rank for you if Dalton Kincaid and Sam Laporta and Michael Mayer, Luke Musgrave, if those guys were in this draft class?
He'd be tight end 1. I think he's
okay.
Awesome. I think he's, like I said, worth trading up for it. And it may not take a ton because, again, if you have like a real strong plan, I want to feature a tight end. That's what's missing from my offense. He's going to be a top 5 tight end, I think, like next year in the NFL. That's just how good he was at Georgia from his freshman year to his junior year. He's just a super natural dude and a super high-end athlete too. The only thing is, he's 6'4", 240. He's not quite the size of an inline blocker. He excels best when he's a detached blocker, where that's him, off the line of scrimmage, either coming across formation, leading out into space, climbing to the second level, one-on-one against a defensive end. He's probably not going to be great at that in the NFL. He's probably going to be quite frankly, bad at that. So that's just a limitation you have to live with. But the receiving ability, the after the catch ability, it's awesome. I mean, he got doubled. I go back to that Auburn game, whereas the Auburn defense coordinator was so upset that he was chirping people on Twitter that were saying, why don't you double Brock Bowers? And he had to say, I doubled him almost the entire game. It was the plays where he wasn't doubled that he's pretty much went off for over 100 yards in that game. And that's just kind of who he is. He's just a wide receiver playing tight end who, if you just treated him as a wide receiver, you'd probably still be drafted in the first round.
The size stuff and the alignment stuff and some of the descriptors sound a lot like Sam Laporta. Just the way that he was able to translate and hit the ground running with that athleticism in year one. But I imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, that Brock Bowers is a little bit more polished in some of the, because that was my skepticism with Laporta that obviously didn't matter in the NFL, was some of those intricacies of route running and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and again, how he was deployed with Detroit, he's not really running. They're not asking him to run complex routes. He runs a lot of just one cut or vertical sort of things, horizontal sort of things. So yes, if I were to compare him to anyone in last year's class, that's probably the most similar skill set. But I think Bowers is just already a much better route runner than Amy Laporta is.
What about running back? Right, we both cut you off. So what?
Yeah.
How bad is this running back class?
Running back just does not have a guy at the top. There's just not one guy who I feel good about coming in and he's a 3-down bell cow, asking him to do whatever, and he's going to be able to do it. There's just not that guy. And then it's honestly pretty thin of guys. But what it does have is like size. There are a lot of guys who have NFL caliber, height, weights, whether in power to play at the NFL game. So there's a lot of guys I believe in their running style translating. So whether that's Blake Corum, the Michigan running back, whether that's Trey Benson, the Florida State running back, whether it's Braylon Allen, the Wisconsin back, or Audric Estime, the Notre Dame back, they all have the size burst that it takes to run between the tackles at the NFL sort of concepts. They're just not particularly dynamic, any of those guys necessarily. They don't have great top end speed, and they're not guys you're going to feature in really the passing game. So it's kind of got limited skill sets in this running back class. And truthfully, there's not a lot of guys who I'd have graded over Chase Brown in this class. Unfortunately, there's definitely not 10 backs better in this class than Chase Brown. Maybe not even 5 backs better than Chase Brown in this draft class. So
just to clarify, where did you have Chase?
I had Chase as a 4th rounder last year. I thought he was actually a better prospect then. I just worried about the fumbles with him. Obviously, we haven't necessarily seen if he's fixed those or not because he hasn't got enough workload to show that. But he had a ton of fumbles his last year at Illinois. But without those, I thought he was a much better prospect than where he ended up getting drafted.
So you got Chase Brown, who is a pretty explosive player. We've seen when he gets the ball in space, when he can stick his foot in the ground and get upfield. He has that long speed. He has the acceleration. And I thought at the NFL level, he showed more ability to run through tackles than I was expecting. It sounds like you're describing a running back class that could complement what the Bengals have pretty well if they choose to go find another running back. The fate of Joe Mixon's future with the team still in the air, of course, in January. But is that a fair assessment, or is that looking for hope or something where it doesn't really exist?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're just looking to replicate, so just say Joe Mixon's out of the picture now, how do we replicate what we had with Joe Mixon? I think your best bet is with Chase Brown. And then, you want to find the Samaje Perine to Joe Mixon. This class has guys that I think can do that, but you're not going to find too many better, guys who can impersonate what Joe Mixon did than what Chase Brown already can do on the roster.
Is there a Roshan Johnson in this class?
That's a good question. I think that's Trey Benson, right? The Florida State running back. I think that's the closest comp for him, is just a taller, bigger running back who can break tackles between the tackles and pick up some tough yardage for you. I think that's probably the closest comp for him. But again, with so few backs, they might get pushed up a little bit higher than you'd like. And so for a guy like Trey Benson, he could still go, in the 3rd round, whereas that's probably just too early for me if I'm the Cincinnati Bengals making a decision on running back right now with all the other needs on this roster.
Up next, we'll continue the draft conversation and discuss a little bit more of potential 1st-round targets at pick number 18. Today's show is brought to you by Jay's Case. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the craziness and realities of real life, but let's get real for a minute. According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than not being able to get the medicine for myself or loved ones that is needed. And thankfully, you'll be okay. We'll be okay due to Jace Medical. The Jace Case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics that treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including respiratory infections, skin infections, stuff that could happen to anyone. And all you have to do is go to jacemedical.com, complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board certified physician and dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. And right now you can get $20 off your order by going to jacemedical.com and use offer code locked on. Again, that's offer code locked on to get $20 off your order at jacemedical.com.
All right, Mike, let's talk ideal first round scenarios for the Bengals. You've talked about a few targets. You mentioned Amarius Mims, who is a new name to me. I, of course, familiar as a not draft aficionado, not college football aficionado. Still knew who Joe Alt, Olu Fashanu, and J.C. Latham are. But when you're looking at that 18th pick, what's the ideal? He's fallen a couple spots past where he was expected to go. Ideal targets for the Bengals.
I do think it's Amarius Mims. It's like one of your dream scenarios. And there's a chance he can because he didn't start at Georgia until the playoff last year. Starts this year, gets hurt. He only plays like half a season. So he hasn't played a ton of football, which might scare away some teams. But I watch his tape and I just see a guy at 6'7", 340 that moves extremely well. And his technique is exceptionally good for a guy who really hasn't played a ton of football, to where, if he would have actually had a full healthy season and been able to, he could have been easily, top 10 pick, could have been talked about just behind guys like Joe Alt and Olu Fashanu. So I think that's the dream scenario. I've said J.C. Latham, I think, is a great option. I think Taliesa Fuaga is an Oregon State right tackle as well, who's probably a little bit behind those guys, but is also, in any given year, a guy who could be worthy of like the 18th overall pick at offensive tackle. Like, there's just a lot of names in this tackle class. But also, if you do lose T. Higgins, if he is out the door this year, it's a great wide receiver class too. Like, I keep going back to those two positions because they're so loaded year on year comparatively. And they just make so much sense for the Cincinnati Bengals that they can make an immediate impact at either of those. So if someone like Keon Coleman, the Florida State wide receiver, is on the board for you there, I think he'd be, he's almost like a T. Higgins clone at 6'4", 215 pounds with great ball skills. Or a guy like Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU, who's also tall, 6'4", but he runs like a 4.3, has some more speed element that would really, a guy that can take the top off opposing defenses so they can't put all their attention on Jamar Chase. You have another guy that runs in the 4.3s that can really scare people. So those are probably, if I'm looking at names, I'm a Bengals fan, those are like the 5 guys that any of those 5 I'm really happy with. If that's ultimately the pick, I pick 18.
Naturally, and I think you're spot on, we could certainly be talking about offensive tackle and wide receiver. Again, it seems like 2021 all over. There's multiple ties back to that. Which one is deeper to get to day 2? Let's not even go to day 3. And I know we're talking about first rounders, but I do think certainly in 2021, part of the conversation was offensive line wise, and it didn't work out for the Bengals because they picked the wrong guy, which we bring up all the time. It feels like with Jackson Carman. But if you take Chase at 5, you can still get a good offensive lineman in round 2. Is that the case if you go with a Coleman or one of these receivers, or is it the opposite where you're more likely to get a quality wide receiver that can complement Jamar Chase in round 2?
I think in this class, it's wide receiver in round 2 is much deeper. And that's a lot of classes.
Sure.
Tackle is just a thinner position. You just look at the tackles that are the elite tackles around the NFL. They're first rounders for the vast majority of them. It's an easy position to identify who has that ceiling. So I do think, yes, tackle is going to be the scarcer position, and wide receiver, especially this year as well. Not only is the top end talent there, but the depth is different in that there are guys with, last year, day 2, you're picking a bunch of sub 6 foot, sub 190 pound type of wide receivers, Josh Downs, the bunch of Tank Dell, the guys who just have to play a certain role in an offense. I was trying to think of the Packers wide receiver, Jaden Reed, like a bunch of guys who just have to play a certain role in an offense. This year is not really the case. There's a lot of guys, whether it's, like Adonai Mitchell from Texas or Jalen Polk from Washington or Xavier Leggett from South Carolina. These guys are all 6'2 plus, 210 plus pounds. Like there's real size in this draft class outside of the first round, just because there's so many talented wide receivers. So it's a different class in terms of what they bring to the table. That I think, just the Bengals, I don't think they'd trend towards those smaller guys. That's not what they want in this offense. So definitely a wide receiver class that suits what they probably want.
Say the Bengals choose to prioritize athleticism instead of size this year. Amarius Mims, you mentioned that he moves well, and this is for tackle and for wide receiver. Are these guys also, that it's deep enough where you're not sacrificing one too much for the other in this class?
I think so. There's a lot of speedsters in this class as well at the wide receiver position. And then I'd say those two top tackles I mentioned, Mims and Latham, are going to test out pretty well. Fuaga, maybe not as much. But then there's a guy in Tyler Guyton from Oklahoma who's going to test out really well at the offensive tackle position. It's a really, those two classes are just awesome. That's why I keep like raving about it. But like those two classes year on year, what you see from those positions is just truly different and truly like once every 5 to 6 year sort of classes at each of those positions.
Is there any position? Actually, let me ask this: safety wise, what's it like? Because Bengals fans think Dax Hill stinks. At least some of them do. I'm not saying I feel that way, but they're out on him. There's discussion on social media about drafting a safety early. Is this the class to do that? I know nothing about the safety class at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a great safety class, I'll say, but there's a handful of guys that I do really like in it. I'm a big fan of Cam Kinchens from Miami, Tyler Newman from Minnesota, Javon Bullard from Georgia. Those three guys I'd probably say are going to probably end up top 50 players on my board. And so, I think they're better prospects than like Jordan Battle was last year. But am I going to give up on Dax Hill and Jordan Battle right now to draft one of those guys? Maybe Kinchens. Kinchens is probably the only one I'd say that if he's sitting there in the second round, still on the board, that I think you're getting a darn good player, like a versatile all-around safety that can really play. So, the one other name I'll also mention is, why am I blanking on his name? He's Utah safety who also plays running back. And I can't think of his name off the top of my head. But
Cole Bishop?
No, it's different. It's
Sione Vaki?
Sione Vaki. There you go. He declared early. That guy's, if you watch his tape, it's absolutely hilarious. He's only played 2 years of college football, did a 2-year more mission, came back and is a sophomore declaring for the draft because his tape this year was that good. But he had like over 150 receiving yards against USC, had 150 rushing yards against Cal, and he played safety full time in all those games. So he's a guy that if you really want a box safety, if you really want like a physical enforcer, because they missed a lot of that with Von Bell this past year, a guy that could actually make tackles and make plays around the line of scrimmage. You just didn't have that in the safety group. He's a guy that I'd be looking at too. So yeah, there's options, but it's also like, I think you probably end up letting your guys that you have homegrown already start to develop.
And he can complement Chase Brown.
Yes, that actually, that would be a good compliment to Chase Brown. He is one of the best backs in this draft class. As weird as it is to say, he had like 30 carries, but he was awesome on them.
That is a very bizarre.
I'm so in.
Thing to say.
I'm so in. Your third.
You should go
safety.
check out his tape. It's hilarious watching him. He's amazing.
Third safety and Chase Brown compliment. Like,
let's get some
awesome.
two-way players in the NFL.
Mike? Day 3, or is he?
Vaki?
Yeah.
So I think he goes day 2 because he declared after his sophomore year. It's not. You wouldn't do that unless you got a pretty high grade. I have a pretty high grade on him. He's going to run low 4.4s, maybe high 4.3s. His like GPS numbers were awesome. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that guy's game.
That's why we come to Mike Renner for our draft primers, find about two-way players for the NFL. Last question before we get out of here. We haven't talked about first-round defenders outside of Newton really at all. Are there any corners, edge players, Latu, Verse, McKinstry, Wiggins that you think are going to be worth it if the Bengals choose to go back to early defense?
The one guy I would really like for the Bengals especially is probably Kool-Aid McKinstry. And now he's not super high-end athlete, so he might fall to that point in the draft, but he's just good at football. Like, he's just a versatile, he can tackle, he can play press coverage, he can play off coverage. And that's why I like him for the Bengals, because obviously defensively they do everything, right? That's what they covet, especially in their secondaries, guys who are versatile, that don't have to be pigeonholed into a scheme. And to me, he's the most scheme just agnostic corner in this draft class, can basically do it all. So it may not be, swing for the fences, but he's a guy that has a very high floor at the corner position, that if you're looking at this Bengals roster, you might just be thinking, hey, we could use that come, playoff time with what we have in our secondary right now. A guy is just good at football.
Kool-Aid on one side, juice on the other with Cam Taylor-Britt. You got, I'm
delicious.
all name team. It sounds great to me, especially if they can get Vaki in round 3.
That would be a ferocious secondary. I'd watch that.
The idea there would be you have a bunch of scheme versatile pieces, because Dax Hill, a lot of Bengals fans want him in the slot, want him in the box.
Yeah.
And Jordan Battle came on really well, can kind of play anywhere, played anywhere in Alabama, played everywhere in the Bengals defense. You got Mike Hilton playing some safety, playing some slot. You got a bunch of guys that can move around a ton. There's something there. We know Lou Anarumo, who, as of today, does not have nearly as many head coaching requests as Brian Callahan's 4. Lou's at 0, as far as we know. Loves that versatility, loves the secondary guys, so could be fun.
They do it every year. I mean, and it's a good strategy, in my opinion, in today's NFL, is to just have as many guys at that, just in the secondary as possible that are high floor players. Maybe you don't have necessarily, and the Bengals obviously haven't had like a number one guy, a island guy. But if everyone that you're throwing out is not making mistakes, well, then, you're going to be tough to sustain drives against. So I do agree with that's how I would want to build the defense, just have as many guys back there that can do as many things as possible.
A ton of ways this could go between now and the draft. You have to get through free agency. The Bengals have a lot of difficult decisions to make there, and you got to get through the draft process. We haven't had the combine. We haven't had the all-star games. And Mike, we might be talking to you again after some of those to talk about what we learned and how this draft class is looking after we have some more information. Until then, Mike, we appreciate it. Go find his podcast, Renner Ranks, on the Locked On Network. Find him at Mike Renner _ on Twitter. Until next time, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.